It's 1 a.m. and my Uber is winding its way home along the 110 freeway back to Pasadena. My driver seems to be in a talkative mood. "So what do you do?" he says. I sit forward and try to clear my head after a long evening. "I'm a seismologist," I say. I study earthquakes. "Earthquakes?" he says. "So can you tell me when the big one is coming?" The big one. The massive earthquake that California is overdue for. Whenever I tell people what I do, this is the one burning question they have for me. Knowing when the big one is coming feels like it could give us some control over our lives. Lives that every Angelino spends on the unpredictable, uncontrollable ground that broods beneath our feet. California lies on the boundary between two giant tectonic plates. These blocks of the Earth's crust are on the move, sliding past each other about the rate our fingernails grow. Where they meet along the 800-mile-long San Andreas Fault, they're stuck together. The fault has built deserts, mountains, and lakes, its beauty concealing its destructive power. As the plates try and slide past each other, they stretch, storing up energy like a coiled spring. When the energy becomes too great, the fault snaps, the plates slide past each other in a giant earthquake. Big earthquakes like these, where the fault slides tens of feet, happen to each part of the fault, on average, every 1 to 2 centuries. When the last big one hit Northern California in 1906, it reduced San Francisco to rubble. Here at the southern end of the San Andreas, we haven't had a fault rupture in over 300 years. As I told my driver, I study earthquakes, using supercomputers to simulate earthquakes on the San Andreas, a lot like the big one. From the safety of my desk, I create ruptures that go up and down the fault, trying to understand how the earthquakes start and what makes them stop. But all this work has taught me that earthquakes are unruly beasts, fascinating, but terrifying and unpredictable. We don't know when, but we know that the big one is coming. I turn back to my driver and say, "I'm sorry to disappoint. We don't know when the big one is coming, but we do know it's not a question of if, but when." I don't know if it's the winding of the 110 freeway or the thought of the next earthquake, but I'm starting to feel a little nauseous. I reach for the window to let in some slightly purer air. "That sounds pretty scary," the driver says. "What's going to happen in the next big one?" His question pushes my mind out of my seat, high above the ground, giving me a view of the whole of Southern California. The San Andreas Fault is a scar in the landscape, separating the San Gabriel Mountains from the Mojave Desert to the north. Crossing that scar is a thin vein carrying the blue lifeblood of our desert city, the Los Angeles Aqueduct, transporting water from the eastern edge of the Sierras to Los Angeles. Aqueducts such as this one transport over 88% of the city's water across the San Andreas Fault. One slip of the fault severs the city's lifelines. In my head, I imagine the big one starting miles underground. The rupture unzips the fault, and once unzipped, each side starts to slide relative to the other, several feet per second. Once it starts sliding, it sends out seismic waves in all directions, shaking the ground and everything on top of it. In a matter of seconds, the fault slides 20 feet. The impacts are immediate. Los Angeles loses access to 80% of its water as seismic waves break gas mains, bring down power lines, and spark thousands of fires. Roads broken. Cell towers overloaded. At the end of it all, the damage to our city is immense. $200 billion of damage. Families fleeing ruined homes. 2,000 lives lost. My car hits a bump, bringing me out of my head and crashing back into the seat. My driver is still sat there, waiting to hear what the big one will do. I catch his concerned eyes in the rearview mirror. Even though I study earthquakes, I have a tiny bit of a puzzle that is immeasurably complex. We can't predict the future. We don't know what's going to happen. Here and now, I need to translate an interwoven, tangled web of knowns and unknowns into the clearest possible answer. But I can't tell a tale of just destruction. Instead, I want to tell a story of the progress that we've made and the steps that we, as individuals and a society, can take to get ready. I lean forward and I say to my driver, the earthquake is going to hit us. But it's what we do right now that determines how bad it will be. I recite the familiar words of earthquake safety. Purchase emergency supplies. Have an emergency plan to meet your loved ones. When the shaking starts, drop, cover, and hold on. But I don't just leave it at that. I talk about the progress that we've made, the network of seismic sensors we now have monitoring the fault 24 hours a day, ready to send us precious seconds of warning when the big one starts. The monitoring and measurement of dangerous faults throughout the state, and the strengthening of vulnerable buildings and pipelines. Science can't let us predict every random geological event, but it can help us understand and prepare for those events. We can avert disaster. The scenario that I imagined is not our only path. Preparation lets us tame the fear that uncertainty creates in our minds. And it lets us tame the threat that earthquakes pose to our lives. Generations of research mean that we have never been more prepared for earthquakes. My ride's nearing its end, and I realize that I've forgotten to add something, perhaps the most important thing. Preparation is not just about medical supplies and bottled water. We need to get to know our neighbors, I say to my driver. He looks at me quizzically, wondering what I mean. Get to know who lives next door to you, who might need help in the earthquake. Maybe it'll be you that needs the help. If we pull together as a community, we can get through this. I thank my driver and step out into the cool night air. A few weeks later, I find myself in a bar in Palm Springs. A woman sits down next to me, introduces herself, and then says, "So, what do you do?"